I'm excited to start this conversation on acquisition reform. It's a topic that I feel like is somewhat perennial in Washington and in policy circles. Jonathan, I want to hop over to you. You served on this commission, which was formed out of the 2022 NDA and really has a lot of congressional backing and you served with a lot of heavy hitters on acquisition reform as well as defense policy in general. I want to get a sense of what is the PPBE, which stands for planning, programming, budget, and execution. What is this process? How did we get it? And what role has it served historically for the U.S.?
Yeah, Connor, thanks for the question and thanks for hosting this conversation. PPBE really came out of the McNamara Defense Department in the 1960s. The idea being that you needed to have a systematic way of identifying needs and putting resources against those needs. And so the system has evolved a little bit over the time. So when it was first created, it was PPBS. Execution was something that was added on about 10, 15 years ago. And the goal, I think, is a laudable one of making sure that you're making sort of thoughtful decisions about how to allocate resources, given that resources are limited and that the defense enterprise is vast. But I think over time, everyone has recognized that it doesn't do as good a job as it could in ensuring that we're doing those needed resource allocation decisions in a timely way. And that's especially true given the pace of change of technology and the sort of evolving pace at which defense capabilities, those defense needs change and evolve. And so the commission was created, as you noted, out of the FY22 NDAA. And the goal was to take a look from soup to nuts on starting with the strategy process, and then as that strategy is translated into a definitive defense program, and then translated into a budget in order to fund that program, and then ultimately execute it. And to really look at all those steps and to make sure that we are doing things as quickly and with as much analytical rigor as possible so that you can make good quality decisions in a timely way to meet the defense modernization challenge. So I can go a little bit into the recommendations if that's where you'd like to go, or however you want to.
Yeah, I think, looking at the PPB&E system, like you mentioned that it, served a function, served a role that was important during kind of the early Cold War and really throughout the Cold War. But now we're kind of in this new age where we don't have one prime threat. We have, several kind of great powers that we're looking at. But we're also in this new age of technology that really fundamentally changes how we think about it. One of the stats that I've come across is that in the 1960s, the U.S. Defense Department was, incorporated about 35% of global research and defense acquisition spending on research and development. And now that's less than 1% of global R&D. So looking at how we've transitioned, why do we still have this process? What are some of the barriers that we have faced as we've looked into reforming it? Why is this still a process that we've incorporated?
Yeah, I guess I would start with thinking about it in terms of where do defense capabilities arise from? So it used to be that there was less of a divide between, say, a commercial airplane and a military aircraft. We all remember the Arsenal democracy stories where, auto plants were transformed into aircraft plants and ultimately transformed back into auto plants after the war. And so there was an element of research and development that was being done for defense purposes, had all of these natural spillovers into the broader economy. And that process allowed for sort of a more efficient fielding of defense capabilities. What we saw over time is that defense capabilities became more specialized. And so, a high-end attack fighter is a very different thing than a wide body passenger jet. And so, you saw the depth of technology and the specifics of sort of what was needed to create a defense capability start to become more and more specialized, and you saw fewer and fewer firms sort of involved in this. And then you had sort of this seminal moment in the post-Cold War era, where basically the Defense Department told the defense industry, you got to consolidate. And so you went from having a field that had, a dozen, 2 dozen prime contractors, and you went down to just a handful of primes. And so over time, this process has led to a consolidation and a sort of upskilling of technology that is very defense specific. But now what we're seeing is that that created a sort of a hothouse flower, if you will, where this technology is so specialized and is so unique that we're paying exorbitant prices for it in the defense enterprise, and we're not actually at the cutting edge because it takes us so long to decide what it is that we want and to fund it. And so where we are today is that there's a lot of opportunities that come or that are available to us if we are able to actually make better use of the defense advances and the technological advances that are being made in the broader economy. And so the defense planning, programming, and budgeting and execution process needs to adapt so that you still have a deliberate process so that you're making informed decisions about where to put resources. But if you're doing it wisely and doing it in a manner that makes more and more rapid use of privately developed technologies, we'll end up with a hopefully more efficient system, one that is less costly, one that fields better capability for the warfighter, and that does it more rapidly than the existing system.
Yeah, before we touch on the recommendations that the commission developed, Samantha, I want to get the industry perspective. So we understand, why this PPB&E system was formed and some of the downsides that we've faced. I mean, John mentioned how as defense cuts happened in the 90s, we went from, I think John said 12 to about 5 primes. And Samantha, you work at Palantir Technologies, maybe one of the new primes up and coming, but give us some light of the industry side of working through the PPB&E process. What does that look like? How long does it take? And what are some of the challenges industry faces on going through this process?
Yeah, thanks, Connor. I think the biggest challenge is sort of that predictability, and especially for newer entrants and startups. So to the point on the consolidation, if we want to try to create more competitors in the future, build out new entrants to the defense technology space, it's really challenging because this cycle that defense spending goes through can be 5 years in advance. And even within smaller chunks of that, when you're looking at individual year budgets in advance, those are being done far in advance. So like right now, we're waiting for the president's budget to see, will there be any tweaks going forward for this year? But all the base things in that were put in there last year around this time. And so if you have some new technology that you want to offer the department, or let's say there's an emerging need, I think we saw this with Ukraine, with Israel. If there's something that comes up or we need to fill a capability gap, you can't just slot it in because there's not flexible funding. And so well, the department can go through a process called reprogramming that requires signatures from authorizers and appropriators on Capitol Hill to sort of say, okay, we're going to move some of this money from this purpose because maybe we didn't need all of it over here. There's a whole process of approval for that, and the color of money has to match. And so that can be a big challenge as well. Oh, well, we can't use hardware money to pay for software. And so it becomes really challenging as you're entering the market. You haven't been around a really long time, or maybe you've been selling commercially and you have a great proven technology there. You want to bring it to the department. Well, you're going to have to wait maybe a year, maybe 5 years, a long time to kind of figure out when can something actually scale to production. The small business innovative research program is a great way for some companies to kind of get a start, and there's money authorized for that every year. However, if you want to actually scale that technology, you figure out, okay, it's great, it meets a need. Let's say the Marine Corps is the buyer. They really want to scale this into production. They want a larger contract. Well, they can't because they hadn't planned for that the year prior, and now they they kind of have this surprise. And so there have been several attempts, and I know the commission looked at this to sort of have more flexible or fungible funding in certain areas where you could redirect funds to those needs. And I'd be curious, Jonathan's perspective on how the commission sort of dealt with that issue or what the various opinions were, because that's one piece where if we could have a little bit of flexible funding, it would really help drive competition, drive innovation.
Yeah, happy to talk about that. I mean, I think that was one of the challenges we saw most starkly, that you had programs that were in, the PPBE system right now thinks very linearly, so that you're in, research and development phase, followed by a procurement phase, followed by an operational phase. And so you end up with different types of money that are available for each of those phases. And one of the realities we see in today's marketplace is that a program necessarily could move back and forth between these phases. And so you ought to be able to have the flexibility of funding to be able to move, not just use operational money to do a small upgrade to a system, or use some procurement money to early on start buying early pilot products if there's an early capability that can be fielded. And so certainly transforming the budget structure so that you get less tied down by these colors of money was one of the most important recommendations coming out of the commission.
Yeah, let's dive into the recommendations a little more. So the commission not only came up with a great list of kind of line items that the DoD can implement, but it also came up with sort of a holistic fundamental change of how DoD should think about acquisition, and recommended totally replacing the PPB&E process to the DSR process, or the Defense Resourcing System. So John, tell us a little bit more about how the commission came up to this conclusion of completely kind of revamping acquisition and what this new process is meant for.
Yeah, I think the way I think about it is that the new Defense Resourcing System that we recommend is intended to get us into a new mindset, so that instead of we proceed through the planning process and then, planning and then into programming and then into budgeting, then instead we think about these things holistically, and so that we're doing analysis throughout the process that allows us to make more rapid decisions and be more flexible depending on how circumstances are changing. As Samantha noted earlier, it can take 5 years for an idea to finally make its way into a program of record, and that's just too slow given the defense challenges we face. And so what we're trying to do through these recommendations is shorten that process, so that if analysis indicates a new need, or if testing indicates a new capability is actually ready to be fielded, that you've got that flexibility built into the system earlier on.
Yeah, and so you talk about how this new kind of system, this DRS system, is meant to address the challenges we face today. Samantha, from Palantir, perspective, Palantir has been around for a while, right? Like since the early 2000s of when it was founded, to kind of this rising juggernaut that it is today. How is industry changing to address the threats that the U.S. faces, and how are we still lagging from these systems that John talks about, these exquisite, very expensive systems, to the actual systems we need today, which are actually probably cheaper and smaller and scalable?
Sure. And I guess thank you for the compliments of the company. I don't know if I would say we've quite reached juggernaut status, but I'll take that as a very nice compliment. We're certainly trying very hard to take our commercial learnings and integrate them into the defense side of our business. The company is actually about half and half commercial government at this point. I think a lot of people don't know that, but that's one way we've tried to really innovate quickly, is we can use our commercial customers where we're doing large scale projects like with Airbus and others, and take those learnings and translate them to the defense space. So that's been exciting. And that's one way a lot of commercial companies are trying to adapt to the defense landscape. But the barriers to entry are still a big challenge. I think a lot of our audience maybe has seen the recent memo that came out from Secretary Hegseth saying we're going to change the way we acquire software in particular. We're going to look at using CSOs and other transaction authorities, which a simple way to translate that is contracting vehicles that look a little more commercial in nature than the traditional government contracting process, so that there's a little more of a menu of options to work with those companies on terms they're used to operating with in the commercial space. And so that's one way I think the department's trying to accelerate adoption of commercial technology or software from vendors that are doing this day to day out in the commercial market. I think it'll still be a challenge with, they call it the valley of death, where it's like you get a small research project either through CBER, or maybe you're doing a test and evaluation agreement or a CRADA with an agency where you're trying to test something out. Getting then that further funding, like we still have that problem, the lack of flexible funding, that blockage, but there's a lot of ways that companies can look to work with the department currently, either through using some of these newer contract vehicles. A lot of these reforms came out when Chairman McCain was in charge of the Armed Services Committee and Mac Thornberry was in charge of the House Armed Services Committee. A lot of reforms came out in that time, sort of expanding the use of other transactions. DIU was set up before then and then transitioned. They dropped the X on experimental to just become DIU permanent and started scaling programs and got their own acquisition authority. So all of those little building blocks have been put into place over time. They've been using CSOs for a lot of their contracts. So we've seen some of this in smaller scale pieces. And now we sort of have an opportunity with this new memo to see how does this scale a bit more broadly. So if the services are going to start using these agreements in larger scale IT or software procurement vehicles, it remains to be seen. There's supposed to be implementation guidance out 30 days from the memo. And I think that's going to be key, right? Because you can use those vehicles, but you can still run into the trap of, oh, well, we'll give you an OT, but here's like a 7-page addendum saying that you have to submit labor rates and give us all your IP and all of these things that make it challenging. And so what's going to be in those implementation documents? Is it going to suggest certain contract types? Are we using firm fixed price? Are we using cost plus? Will there be guidance there sort of directing to more of a commercial approach, or will it be more open-ended where we could still run into some of the same challenges that we see today with this sort of build versus buy dynamic? And that's the hardest part, I think, about working with the government, is figuring out how that decision is being made. When do we decide we need to build something? When can we just buy something commercial and adapt it? There's a law in place from the Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act, or FASA, you might have heard that acronym, that basically led to this commercial item preference that's now in US code and is implemented through the FAR, that says, you need to buy commercial where possible. And not only do you need to do that, but you need to modify requirements to make it commercial where possible. And if you can't do that and you're custom building, primes that are custom building still then need to be engaging commercial subs. But in practice, we don't see that happen as often as we would like, because there's always a reason. Maybe it's a security reason. Maybe it's, well, this is just challenging and the government needs to own the architecture. Or this all has to be government purpose rights. The government needs to own all of this at the end of the day. And that can really create a challenge for commercial vendors to come in and provide their technology. So figuring out where's that appropriate balance, how can the government go faster in adapting commercial where possible, and what does that look like? Like, what are clearer lines of operation there? I think as they go through the implementation of this new memo, we might get clearer guidance that helps companies that are trying to get into this space better understand how to operate, how to offer technology, how to adapt technology to government need. But it's an exciting time to see where all of that goes. So I remain hopeful that progress will be made and we'll all find a better way to exist in this ecosystem together.
Yeah, Samantha, one thing you said really caught my ear, which is, the difference between sort of the available authorities and the practice of so many of the officials. And that was one thing that struck us as we were looking at the budgeting process in particular, that so many of the ways of work that DoD civilians have, and DoD military as well, is based on sort of just understandings or sort of perceptions of what the rules are, as opposed to, actually making full use of the flexibility that, Chairman McCain and Chairman Thornberry, wrote into law over the years. And so one of the big, so as we were talking to the, over 400 witnesses that we had at the commission, one of the questions we would ask is, well, why don't you use this authority? Because they'd acknowledge, oh yeah, no, we know we can do that, but we don't. And well, why not? And often the answer was, well, because the Hill would get mad at us. And it's like, well, how do you know that? Did you talk to them? Did they say that this was a problem? Well, no, but I mean, we just know they would be mad at us. And so one of the big recommendations that, we put out a set of recommendations around sort of how to build more trust between the congressional committees that are most focused on this and the defense, folks working in the process, to increase communication so that there is less just sort of assumption that, well, gosh, Congress wouldn't want us to do that, when, the fact that Congress voted into law suggests maybe they would like you to do it now and again. So.
Yeah, let's pull on that thread about Congress and the Hill's role in acquisition. And John, you have a lot of experience on the Hill, serving in leadership both in the Senate and in the House. Talk a little bit more about, Samantha talked about the role that the administration can play, but the Congress is in charge, has a lot of sway over budgets. Talk about how Congress can help support this transition process into a better acquisition process, and what they need to think about and focus on as we try to reform this system.
Yeah, well, I'll start with a little history piece, which is, the very first NDAA was in 1961 and was 1 page long. The most recent NDAA was 1,813 pages long. Now, some of that was unrelated stuff that had nothing to do with defense or just catching a ride. But the fact is that over time, Congress has gotten a lot more detail oriented in how it approaches its role in this process. And so, if we can reasonably expect that the system is going to need to be able to move more quickly, move more flexibly, can't simply be locked into a decision made once a year, then Congress has to be willing to sort of let go of the reins a little bit. But in order to get them to do that, the Defense Department is going to have to be more forthcoming with information on a regular basis so that Congress can have confidence that the most important elements of congressional intent are going to be honored. And so, a couple of things that we thought would be useful in that vein: establishing a sort of classified information sharing environment that both Congress and DoD would be in together to allow more rapid sharing of information. Restructuring how the justification books. So, this is really in the weeds, but, every year DoD kills a small forest in order to deliver to the Hill, literally reams and reams of books that are so-called justifications for the request of the budget. And the fact is, so much of what's in those books either goes unused entirely, but then later serves as almost a girdle almost on DoD's execution of the budget. That if we can restructure those so that they're providing information that's actually relevant to congressional decision makers, and does it in a way that is, sort of transparent about sort of here are the puts and takes that we're considering and why we ended up in this circumstance. These things that, if together are done, create confidence that Congress's role is being respected and that Congress is being, considered a true participant in the decision making. I think there's a lot more flexibility that Congress would be willing to provide. And the other thing that would be important, Samantha mentioned earlier, reprogramming. The reality that we only pass a budget once a year, hopefully, and the long period of time between those budgets means that necessarily DoD is going to need the flexibility to be able to reprogram some amount of funds. And so DoD historically has abused that authority, and when it's been abused, it's then the amount of money that they've had the flexibility to reprogram has been reduced. And so hopefully we're going to be entering a cycle where we establish more trust so that Congress can give more flexibility so that there is more reprogramming allowed in between budgets, just given the realities of sort of cycle times. So.
Yeah. Samantha, I want to talk about, manufacturing and the defense industrial base and industry's role in, really actually arming the United States and this kind of signals that they need from the government, whether it's, the administration or budgeting from the Hill. When industry looks at long-term projections, and John's talking about yearly budgets coming from the president's office as well as from the Hill. And as we think about manufacturing and how kind of dilapidated U.S. manufacturing has become, whether it's shipbuilding, sort of one Chinese shipyard is the biggest Chinese shipyard, includes all of the shipyard manufacturing power of all the US's shipyards. And so what does industry look for from Congress and from the administration as they think about investing in some of this hardware and some of these brick and mortar manufacturing needs that the US is trying to look for?
Yeah, that's a challenging area because obviously to sustain, build up, hire, train a workforce, have all the capital equipment you need to do this type of manufacturing, it's a huge investment. And so that's why you see a lot of traditional primes that are in this space because they've been doing this for a very long time. They've bought other companies. There's been a lot of consolidation, in part because of supply chain concerns, production line concerns, having the right workforce. And so there's a huge barrier to entry for anyone new to come into this space, just because when you look at the capital required, it is just a huge investment. And so, of course, the company's currently doing it, and then some of the new ones. And I think you see a lot in the drone space. There's a lot of newcomers. I think there's other areas where you'll see additional competitors. I think there are some in maybe a smaller craft shipbuilding, other areas that are coming into this space. And I think the way they're doing it is they're sort of looking at what's been in the budget, what's the need, what's the emerging need. A lot of those companies will have prior service members that understand the problem sets really well, or maybe they're even founded by them. And so they're looking at this and figuring out, okay, what are we going to need 5 years from now, 10 years from now? What do we start making today that leads to that? And they're tracking the budgets and they're watching that. But there is sort of this element of flexible funding or advance notice that is needed. I think one of the biggest challenges companies have is understanding that need on the classified side. So in order to work on any classified projects, and as you could imagine, munitions, shipbuilding, nuclear enterprise, there's a lot of areas that fall into these categories. You have to have what's called a facilities clearance for your company. So your company has to go through this process with DCSA and sort of be blessed to be able to hold classified information or to have people in the company work on the information. You can't just say, oh, well, we have some former service members, they're cleared, they're going to go ahead and take a look at this. It doesn't work like that. The whole company has to be allowed to have access in order to do that. And to be approved to even go through that process, you first have to get a contract. And so there's so many steps in place. And that area of government too is understaffed. And so it's hard to move quickly through the process once you are in the process. And so that's challenging because how do companies understand, like you can track the budget, you can see what's publicly available, but how do you really understand at a granular level, what are those needs? I think one approach some companies will take is they'll get a subcontract and they'll work for a prime contractor that can kind of help sponsor them through that process and figure out what that need is before they're able to go out on their own. But that's a big challenge in the defense space, is understanding what those problem sets are to be able to plan your workforce, your capital expenditures, to build up what capabilities you want to provide to the government. Because some of these things, it's a little easier on the software side to say, oh, well, we provide all this commercial software, we can figure out how to translate that to government. It's pretty hard in certain spaces. Like you're probably not going to be building certain types of munitions for the civilian world. Like there are certain things we just build for national security. And that's where there's a lot of work to do on finding a way to have more awareness. I think IncUtel is a great entity for this. For those that don't know, IncUtel is an organization that is allowed to make early stage investments in companies that it's set up as a nonprofit, but it's associated with the intelligence community. And so the people that run that entity have knowledge of what some of these problem sets are. And so they can go and look at young companies and say, oh, I think there's something here. We want to make an investment here. We want to help guide or direct or be a part of the planning to sort of get them to where they need to be. That's one way that companies, at least with intelligence related offerings, can look at that. But something like that doesn't exactly exist for large scale manufacturing or some of the industries that you've mentioned, Connor. And so that's definitely a gap that could be filled, or that the government could be better about messaging in that way. Because I think the workforce challenges are going to continue to be a concern, and getting people interested in working in these areas and building up more capacity. You really have to have a good understanding of what the need is, how to forward invest, and then what's the delivery and how can we be more efficient in that. I think another area that a lot of large scale manufacturing entities can improve on is efficiency. How fast are they able to turn orders from the government, get them out the door, whether it's building ships or munitions, or even some of the more mundane things that we build for the government. How can you do that faster and more reliably to then understand, what is that life cycle going to be like? And then, of course, the sustainment issue on the back end is a whole other problem we don't have to get into, but it is very complex. And I think sometimes when we talk about this, we do lose sight of the fact that there are some of those industries where there isn't a commercial audience. And when you don't have that commercial audience, you do have to focus on how do you sustain the defense business? How do you have predictability? And that's really hard. And I think we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic, the Defense Production Act actually used for the first time in a very long time for things like ventilators to actually have companies that wouldn't normally manufacture those items, or maybe that did on a small scale, increase production with government investment or government even purchasing and loaning some of the equipment necessary. And if we end up in a large scale contingency, it's possible that the Defense Production Act could have to be activated again. And so that's something to just think about and be aware of, that is an existing law that is available, but is rarely used.
Yeah. One thing I want to follow up on, and John, I want to get your thoughts too, and kind of how the commission has thought about this, but I feel like sometimes there's competing interests between, should we focus on agility or should we focus on predictability? And I think it's only competing in that, the government can only do so much and it can only be good at so many things as it has different priorities. How should the government balance this need of agility and responding quickly to challenges, and responding quickly to needs that the US is facing, but also prioritizing predictability, which is, kind of has the connotation of a little bit more staid, a little bit more slow, but steady. How do you balance those competing interests?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and it's a hard one to reconcile, frankly. You end up in a circumstance where you have to invest in capacity of manufacturing for the long term, and that stuff doesn't come online quickly. And if you need it in the event of a contingency, if you didn't make the investment 2 years ago, it's not going to be available for 2 years. And so there's an element of you've got to overbuy to some degree in order to maintain some capacity. That said, you also have a responsibility, obviously, to the taxpayer to sort of be wise in how you are allocating what is a fixed pie of defense resources. We are unfortunately a country that is, trillions of dollars in debt, and so we don't have the luxury of being able to, be profligate with our spending on defense. And so it is a very fact-dependent decision, and you have to go through sort of capability by capability and make sure that you've got both a sort of surge capacity that allows you to meet emergent needs, even as you are trying to maintain flexibility to bring on new capabilities that may develop. So, I think the Anduril last year announced an investment on their dollar, sort of in a capability primarily, looking at it, probably looks like it's probably going to be primarily around drones and maybe some small missiles. And there is a role to be played in terms of private industry making investments, just as any other company does, without the certainty of there being a buyer, but on the belief based on their research and based on trends in the marketplace that they can find a customer. And so, there's no silver bullet, there's no simple answer, but it is, a consideration that defense policymakers have to keep in mind throughout.
Yeah, it's a good transition to talking about private industry and particularly tech industry and Silicon Valley. And so, Samantha, you're from Palantir, very much a product of Silicon Valley. And I feel like in the past 2 years or so, there's been such a shift in the culture of Silicon Valley in that, just recently Google announced that they're willing to do contracts with the DoD, something that was probably, unheard of 5 years ago, where, a tech industry would be dealing with the government. I want you to talk a little bit about that and like where the tech industry as a whole, whether they're only defense based, but as you mentioned, most defense tech companies are both commercial and defense. But talk a little bit about Silicon Valley, where they were, 10, 20 years ago, and why they are suddenly interested in working with DoD now.
Yeah, I think you're right that there has been more of a recent shift. I think folks might remember that back when there was a lot of initial work on Project Maven and other DoD programs, there were some employee protests at some of those companies. I think Google was one that got a lot of news coverage for that, where employees were saying, we won't do this. They were writing internal letters to leadership, and then companies were actually pulling out of government work. I think that's come around a bit, and I don't know if that's due to increasing threats or sort of the general global instability that we may be facing, where employees at these companies may be more willing to work on national security related issues, thinking about it as a national defense priority. But I think also there was a lot of opacity to working with the government. And so if you were in Silicon Valley and you were working at Google or Meta or even Microsoft up in Seattle, I think a lot of people that worked at those companies just didn't think about working for DoD or defense, because it just looked like there's a group of people that do that. They're working on secret squirrel things. That's not what we do. But, if they want to buy some Microsoft Word licenses for their computers, like that's awesome. We'll sell it to them as a purely out of the box capability. But then that sort of evolved over time to, oh, they need cloud offerings. They need secure cloud offerings. How do we do this? How do we look at that process? And you sort of saw some tension there too, as some of the traditional vendors who offered those things started to face competition from some of these other companies that were doing that commercially. And it was interesting to start watching that shift occur. And now you have a lot more interest in working on those problems. I think too, with the creation of the digital service. So there was the US Digital Service, which is now, I think, turned into a different entity, but the Defense Digital Service that was created under when Ash Carter was secretary. The whole concept of that was, let's take people who work at those companies, who work at Stripe and Amazon and wherever, and they've never worked in defense, but they're interested in solving hard problems at the Department of Defense. And let's bring them in for term assignment. So none of those people are permanent employees, but they come in on rotations that are often a couple years at a time. And let's have them tackle these issues. Let's have them meet with different organizations within DoD. What's your problem? How could we help solve it? And so they brought a lot of talent in that way, of people that would have never worked for defense, that had no background in defense, and kind of exposed them to it. And what's interesting is a lot of the alum of those groups have now gone back out into defense tech and industry and are working on these problems at startups and at larger companies. And that's been really interesting to see. And it does kind of change the culture, because then those individuals can tell their colleagues, hey, I worked on these really hard problems here. It was really interesting. It was really challenging. Like, we should do more of this, because they were exposed to the need and some of the challenges, and they got to live some of that bureaucratic frustration that people that have worked in government their whole lives are used to. And it really inspired a lot of people to want to change and offer something that could actually create efficiencies, move things faster, deliver on time. So it was really interesting to watch that happen and that enthusiasm that came out of that. So it's maybe sort of all of those things converging around the same time that has sort of led to this interest. And I think too, you have companies that have had some early successes there. I think Anduril's done a lot of great things. Data Miner was one that had some really interesting early successes. And so as the venture capital community sees that, and companies that were probably investing a lot in biotech and other civil sectors are looking at defense tech now as, oh, actually, this is really interesting. This is a space where there is opportunity, but also we get to help our national defense. A lot of the venture capital leaders that I talk to are really motivated by being a part of something larger and investing in companies that have the opportunity to contribute to the national defense. And so that entire ecosystem has been shifting, and that's really exciting to see. It's really encouraging. You know, all of the things we talked about previously, we still need to do a lot of work to fix a lot of the barriers to entry, but the trends are positive, and I think we're going to continue to see the tech world, as it were, more interested in contributing to the national defense.
Yeah. If I can just add one thing, earlier this week, or not this week, I guess earlier last week, I was at a dinner that was very focused on sort of the capital markets and defense tech and defense more broadly. And there's definitely an appetite from investors of, whether that's venture, whether that's in the private equity space, to get more resources into this space, because I think it's a real business opportunity. It's a opportunity to do good by doing and do well. That the reality of several $100 billion a year being spent by a customer who is difficult, but is does actually pay its bills, is not an unattractive one to some players in the market.
Yeah, as we think about tech, there's kind of some of the fancier stuff of, we're thinking about autonomy, we're thinking about AI, but there's also kind of the nuts and bolts of, DoD incorporating some basic technologies. And I feel like sometimes there can be like a cultural, divide between the world of Washington and the world of Silicon Valley, and that it's sometimes difficult for these two places to just talk to each other. Samantha, from your perch in Palantir and your connection to the tech world, how well do these worlds actually speak to each other? And what are some of the kind of cultural or professional barriers that really need to be, rethought in order for these two sides to work with each other?
Yeah, I think that still remains a challenge, but it's getting better. So, of course, there's sort of the larger scale things companies can do, right? You can sign up for these big conferences like Space Symposium and Air, Land, and Sea and all of these things if you want to go to a more kind of industry conference or demonstration and engage in that way. There's things like the Reagan Forum that the Reagan Institute puts on. And then, of course, there's all the efforts to connect industry and government and other interested parties that FPRI and other think tanks look into. And those are all super helpful things that have expanded in recent years. But I still think getting the information on the needs and matching technology to needs is still a challenge. And we talked about that a bit today, but for instance, when the government hosts certain industry days where they actually want to talk through problems or challenges or even do demo days, sometimes there are restrictions on participation. So do you have an active contract with this entity, or do you have an active network connected in a certain way on the secure side to be able to participate? There isn't a lot of effort to create sort of unclassified days where interested parties could come in and talk with government counterparts and try to figure out how do we get more involved. There's a lot of work to be done there. There's several small programs But that remains a challenge. And even for larger tech companies, it remains a challenge because some of these things can get very, very specific. And so you might not be able to participate if maybe you're working with this entity, but not this one particular part of it. And so how we bridge that divide more, I think, still needs a lot of work. But I would say it's vastly improved. When I think about 10 years ago, it's like, it was a huge deal if there was like one report about the defense industrial base to include defense tech, and now we have all kinds of working groups and reports and think tank events, and the Hill's doing hearings and subcommittee hearings on these topics, both on broader industrial base, but also looking at defense tech and other areas for increasing competition. I know we talk about defense tech kind of as its own section, but it's really about competition in general. And that also means in the traditional industrial base, in the manufacturing and supply chain side. And so the more we can encourage competition and building out more options and securing our supply chains, the better. So I look forward to seeing more events like this and in others with government participation to further bridge that sort of educational divide that's still out there.
I'll spend the final moments of our time talking about the years ahead. We have a new administration and a new Congress, and as the Trump administration begins to form, a lot of these positions are going to, tech CEOs, VC partners. There's a lot of industry representation, and with that comes opportunities as well as risks. And John, as you think about your work on the commission and the recommendations from the commission, I think we do see a lot of opportunities where I think the Trump administration is willing to break vases in order to remake things, but you also have to rebuild it. So as you think about the commission, your role in the commission, how would you advise, Trump administration as they are thinking about maybe reforming some of this and breaking some old processes? How far is too far? What actually does need to be broken, and where are things where we actually probably should be preserving and need to be a little bit more considerate?
Yeah, I think one of the focus areas for the commission was how do we strengthen the workforce that is handling the space and actually executing on all of these mission sets. And, as we talked about a little bit earlier, one of the challenges is moving people out of a mindset and into one where they're more risk tolerant, risk acceptant. And I think the reality is that if someone is worried about their job, they're not likely to be risk tolerant. And so I think part of what the administration is going to have to do if they really want to make changes in the space and move us to a place where we're more rapidly fielding capability with more flexibility and with less bureaucracy is reestablish trust with the people who are really operating the system, so that they realize that the way to succeed is through taking on risk and using the maximum authorities that have been provided by Congress in this space.
Yeah. Samantha, I want to save my last question for you. We've been bashing on government and bureaucracy and government processes and thinking how we can reform it. But, industry has a role in this as well. And there's certainly ways that industry can reform. If there was like one or two things that you see as a fault or, a downside of industry where they need to change and reform in order to be better partners with the US, where do you see growth for industry?
That's a great question. And I think sometimes, it is really easy to kind of beat up on bureaucracy, but the bureaucracy is also just following all the rules that have been put in place for it by Congress and by bureaucracy before it, creating rules and implementation guidance. So we always have to be mindful of that. But I think industry perhaps could be a better partner to government in part by listening to government, really understanding the needs and having open dialogues on why things are a certain way, translating things in the right way. I think that becomes a big challenge, especially on the commercial side, and the government saying, well, we have this process and here's how we do things. And industry will say, well, this is how we do it commercially, and why can't we just do that? And really it's something in between, and you have to be able to figure that out, but that's having a dialogue and it's translating it in a way that can be understood. And I think we and others have spent a lot of time working with government procurement offices and others, really walking through why things are the way they are, why they look a certain way, and what we can do to be flexible to meet the government where they are as well. And I think more open dialogue is always important. I think there's also an opportunity on that educational side. It's not just with government, but also with Congress, just ensuring that there's more education and understanding of how these different industries operates, what motivates them. And, to the debate we had with Jonathan earlier, having more than single year appropriations would be awesome. McCain used to hammer on, can we at least just do 2 years, like give the bureaucracy time to implement and reflect, and let's do some oversight. And of course, that's really hard for appropriators to agree to, because they really feel an obligation and a duty to ensure that the money's being spent in the right way. And so how do you improve that with transparency? Well, that's also on industry. It's not just government to translate that, but industry needs to be able to effectively communicate what are our needs, what are different blockers that we have in being able to understand the workforce we need and the capital we need to be able to work with the government in this way. And so it really has to come from all parties. And, it's easy to throw mud at each other, but more open dialogue is always going to be a good thing. And participating, I think if industry has strong views and DoD's holding open comment days on a rulemaking process for a new regulation, then industry needs to show up. Industry needs to write in, needs to have its voice heard, and needs to not be shy about that. I think sometimes industry can have a preference of, oh, let's submit this through an association or put comments out there, kind of vaguely or anonymously. That's not always helpful. Government frequently will say, like, please just write in as yourself. Like, if we get a bunch of companies that write in and explain these challenges, then we can have a better dialogue. But if we can't understand where it's coming from or the full reasons, then we can't do anything about it. So industry has to be willing to step out on the ledge and participate in that way as well. So it really has to come from all angles. And I know we're certainly trying to be more vocal in this area, and to work through our First Breakfast initiative with bringing in other small companies and trying to help educate them on the process and helping them get their security process in order to work with the government. I think we can all help each other a whole lot more. It's not each company versus each other. It's all of us trying to solve this national defense mission together. Maybe that sounded cheesy, but it's really how I feel about it.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. Samantha and John, thank you for both joining me to talk about this. And thank you to the FPRI members and board members and partners, as well as everyone attending the event today. If you're interested in learning more about FPRI and the research we do, you can find us at fpri.org. But thank you for attending, and thank you to my guests for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Connor.